In the second scene of Robert W. Chambers' elusive story within a story, The Accursed Play, The King in Yellow, a character named Camilla asks a stranger to take off his mask since everyone else at the masquerade has done the same. The stranger responds by claiming that he wears no mask, and Camilla gasps at the implication. The idea of a monster hiding in plain sight at a costume party is one of several mask-themed horror fiction tropes, and we will appeal to it along with several other decadent, deceptive, and delusional ideas in today's adventure. Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and today we're going to discuss the Ravenloft Domain of Dread known as Dementlieu, the domain of decadent delusion. As always, in my Ravenloft videos, I'm going to give an overview of what the domain is, list some imaginative influences, some media that will help us get an imaginative grip on this domain, and then I'll sketch out an adventure, in this case a 3-act adventure which takes PCs from levels 4 up through level 6. That is, they will end the adventure at level 7. As for the domain itself, well, every night brings another glittering affair in Dementlieu, whose citizens live glamorous and exciting lives. They enjoy the finest clothes, elegant jewels, grand ballrooms, and most extravagantly, the grand masquerade hosted by Duchess Cedra de Honor every 7th day at her island estate. Everyone who is anyone attends the Duchess's balls, and everyone who longs to be someone tries to wrangle an invitation or sneak in uninvited. But Duchess Cedra's wrath upon those who dare to set foot where they don't belong is truly horrible and inevitably fatal. Dementlieu draws from a number of themes, not the least of which is 18th century pre-revolutionary France, but also Cinderella and Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death. This is a domain where everyone pretends to be richer than they are, more important than they are, more decorated than they are, and more accomplished than they are. The domain contains huge amounts of wealth, but the vast majority of people, no matter how aristocratic they behave, are in fact very poor. They wear shiny clothes, all right, but they are pieced together from old rags. They serve fancy pâtés at their dinner, although their ingredients were harvested from the garbage. They may even boast of a royal name, one that they stole from an aristocrat that they murdered in an alley. Now, from her royal mansion in the center of Dementlieu, the Duchess Cedra de Honor rules the entire domain. She is secretly an undead, wraith-like creature who is compelled to destroy anyone who lies or deceives. Her curse, of course, is that she is also compelled to hold a weekly masquerade ball in an impoverished domain. Naturally, everyone is going to try to get at her riches and attend the ball, and so, as an affront to her curse, her masquerade is destined to be attended by fakers. Indeed, in addition to commoners who have stolen rich clothing and fabricated a false part for themselves, the masquerades will also doubtlessly have guests who struck a bargain with a fairy godmother in order to go to the ball. Now, when it comes to influences that help us get an imaginative grip on Dementlieu, the most obvious is the Cinderella story. I would recommend Aschenputtel, the Brothers Grimm version that was published in 1812. It's the most macabre and gothic version of the story, and in it, Cinderella actually comes across as something like a PC adventurer. She has a couple druid-like abilities. She can control birds. There's also Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death, a story in which an extravagant masquerade ball is interrupted by a guest who proves to be none other than Death himself, and a grisly fate befalls all of those who attend the party. We're going to have something like that in our adventure as well. I also recommend the 1991 French film Delicatessen when it comes to getting a good feel for what this domain is like. In this film, a post-apocalyptic French community hangs together by a network of lies and deceptions, one of which is the fact that they are all cannibalistic. The desperation and universal dishonesty is really harmonious with the vibe that we're supposed to cultivate with Dementlieu. I also recommend another 1991 film, The Addams Family. Not because we're going to take too much from its imagery, but we are going to take a central element of the story as our adventure plot. In the Addams Family movie, a crooked lawyer named Tully is conversing with a pair of scam artists. Tully notices that one of the scam artists looks exactly like Gomez's brother, Fester Addams. And so the three hatch a plot. The one who looks like Fester will pretend to be Fester, and the three of them will use that as a pretext to get to the Addams family and plunder it of its valuables. We'll have RPCs play the parts of that crooked lawyer and the two scam artists. I also give a small recommendation to the 1996 French film Ridicule. The film does not contain too much in the way of a plot influence or even an aesthetic influence, but it is a very good piece to watch if you're interested in courtly humor and the role that wit and sycophancy play in an aristocratic court. For instance, at a place like a masquerade ball. Also, as a general recommendation, is the 2002 film The Count of Monte Cristo, a French tale in which everyone is deceiving everyone else and there's a network of lies, and the protagonist triumphs by being the most efficient and cleverest liar. Now, when it comes to Cédra de Honaire's Masquerade Ball itself, it's worth noting a few films which, regardless of whether they are good films, do have visually appealing and imaginative scenes with masquerade balls. In the 1984 film Amadeus, the titular composer attends a masquerade ball where he interacts with both his father and his rival Salieri. There's also the memorable and hallucinatory masquerade ball scene in the 1986 film Labyrinth. The costumes designed by Brian Froud are really excellent. There's also the 2004 film Van Helsing. I hate this film, but it does have a very visually appealing masquerade ball scene. Watch it on mute so you can ignore the clumsy dialogue and the cringeworthy Count Chocula accents. And there's also a frightening but brief masquerade ball scene in the 2007 film Sweeney Todd in the song Poor Thing. Finally, there's the 2017 film, also about Mozart, called An Interlude in Prague. Not a very memorable film, but the costume design is amazing, in particular the masquerade ball. And finally, part of the second act of our adventure is going to take place in the Red Widow Theater. As an inspiration for that part of the adventure, it's worth looking at the scene with the Theater of Vampires in 1994's film Interview with the Vampire. Like that scene in the film, that part of our adventure will feature monsters pretending to be humans, acting out the part of monsters, and therefore hiding in plain sight, killing people on stage. Speaking of those monsters, I highly recommend the monsters from the Crimson Court DLC, released in 2017 for the 2016 game Darkest Dungeon. These monsters are technically some kind of vampire, but they take aesthetic inspiration from sanguinivorous creatures such as mosquitoes and leeches. They're great. In fact, if you want to use versions of those monsters, Core Artificer has adapted some of them for 5e play. Link in the doobly-doo. Okay, with influences out of the way, here's an overview of our adventure. In Act 1, the PCs fail in an attempt to scam some aristocrats out of their valuables. In the wake of their failure, they notice that one of the PCs looks very much like an aristocrat who has gone missing and who is rumored to be best friends with the Duchess Cédra de Honaire. A quest, therefore, is laid out before them. Put on some fancy clothes, impersonate that aristocrat, and go to the Duchess's masquerade and steal all the treasure that's there. In Act 2, after failing to raise money in some way or other, the PCs strike up a bargain with a witch, a hag named Mamie Glyphpion. The PCs are to deliver her coven's hag's eye to the Red Widow Theater, stash it somewhere observant but safe, and then return. In exchange, Mamie Glyphpion will give the PCs fancy clothes, a carriage, and an escort to the Duchess's mansion. They must be careful, of course, for all such enchantments will fade at midnight. And finally, in Act 3, the PCs will attend the masquerade ball of Duchess Cédra de Honaire and find themselves caught up in a horrifying encounter. As I mentioned before, this adventure will take PCs from levels 4 up to level 7, that is through level 6. In Act 1, the PCs will proceed from level 4 to level 5. In Act 2, the PCs will proceed from level 5 to level 6. And in Act 3, the PCs will proceed from level 6 to level 7. So let's get started. We begin with a hot start. The PCs stand ready for combat, wearing aprons, under the supervision of another man wearing an apron and a chef's hat. That man commands them to go and kill. They are standing in an alleyway, and all around them are a horde of vile rats. Now, these rats in particular are custom monsters, which I have based on the scarecrows from Nerdarchy's book Out of the Box, specifically from their encounter 1 crow, 2 crow, 3 crow, scarecrow. These creatures, horrid rats, have a few notable features. The first is that they are flea-infested. Whenever a creature makes a melee attack against them, a cloud of dandruff and fleas and gnats and mange flies up, and the PC must succeed on a DC 11 dexterity save or be blinded by it all. Gross. A second feature is that their bite is poisonous, and a third feature is that they have a ranged give-you-mange attack. As the PCs fight these rats, we should describe them as smelling like sewage, covered in parasites, disgusting, vile creatures. Really play up the body horror with these rats. Because, when the battle is over, the man in the chef's hat who is supervising them tells the PCs to drag the carcasses back inside. And where is inside? Why, it's a kitchen! A very large kitchen in a large, dilapidated, run-down house. Now the chef, who calls himself Pierre, tells the PCs to quick, hurry up, cut the heads off, skin those rats, chop up the meat finely, and then start roasting it and spicing it for the guests outside. The PCs will be prompted to make a number of checks. Survival checks, chef's tools checks, medicine checks, nature checks. Anything which could plausibly contribute to the task of cutting these rats up, mincing their meat, and then spicing it, as it is roasted into a pâté. As the PCs do this, Pierre will make it clear what's going on. He and the PCs are cooperating in a scam. Pierre is actually the PC's associate, René Giod, and his wife, Audrey, is outside in the dining room pretending to be the famous Marquise Dubois. She has invited a number of aristocrats over, and the PCs are going to try to pickpocket and fleece those aristocrats while getting them drunk and serving them rat meat, calling it pheasant. That's the plan, and as soon as the pheasant is ready, the PCs go outside, serve it to a number of waiting aristocrats, and try to distract them with conversation before making some sleight of hand checks and trying to fleece them of their jewels and valuables. Now here in this scenario, many outcomes are possible. Maybe the PCs manage to steal a couple of things, maybe they don't. Maybe they get caught and all of the aristocrats get mad and say they've never been so insulted and they leave, shoveling their mouths full of pâté as they do. Either way, it'll turn out to be a bust, because no matter what happens, even if the PCs are maximally successful, the aristocrats were fakers. They didn't have any money. All of their jewelry is just glass. All of their money is counterfeit. Indeed, the wealth of the guests was as fake as that pâté. Now it is at this moment, in the midst of failure, that René and his wife Audrey notice one of the PCs and exclaim simultaneously, "He looks just like the Count de Montagne de Sieur!" The PCs level up to 5, and we move on to Act 2. Act 2 begins with an explanation. René and Audrey tell the PCs that one of them looks exactly like a very well-known aristocrat, the Count of Montagne de Sieur. The Count of Montagne de Sieur went missing recently. Nobody knows his whereabouts. And yet, the Count is supposed to be very close friends with the Duchess. Surely the Count would be able to get into the Duchess's masquerade. Since one of the PCs looks exactly like that Count, a plan naturally arises. All the PCs need to do is to get a hold of some of the fancy clothing that's necessary to get admitted into the masquerade. Then, once they're there, they'll be able to steal all kinds of valuables and treasure from the mansion. Imagine the treasure! No more eating rat pâté! And so, the PCs are given a quest. Raise some money, find some money, steal some money, or somehow get a hold of some fancy clothes that will allow the PCs to get into the masquerade. Now, it's important to establish here that the fancy clothes which the PCs need are not just clothing. They also include a special magic item, a glimmering courtier's cravat. A courtier's cravat is a magic item whose luster cannot be imitated by any magic spell or magical ability or any College of Creation bard nonsense. The item has to be received from another Dementlieu aristocrat or from the one shop that sells them, Clothing by Flaubert. Unfortunately, Clothing by Flaubert only sells them at 10,000 gold points a pop, so the PCs will need to think of a plan. And here, at this part of Act 2, I think it's important to be open and let the PCs try any number of things. Maybe they can try pickpocketing people, or maybe they can try panhandling. Maybe they can try to burgle Clothing by Flaubert. But regardless of what they try, they should be met with mostly failure. Most of what they pickpocket turns out to be fake, most of what they get through panhandling, likewise. And when it comes to Clothing by Flaubert, it is armed with a magical security system which immediately places a wall of force around all of the courtiers' cravats if someone breaks in addition to alerting the town guard. Now, after the PCs have tried a thing or two and failed a thing or two, a mysterious cloaked woman approaches them. She introduces herself as Dolia and tells the PCs that they clearly need the help of a fairy godmother. She offers to introduce them to one, for she knows of just such a person. The PCs are welcome to do all manner of insight checks and investigative conversation. Dolia should seem honest enough, even if it's clear that she's not telling the PCs literally everything she knows. If the PCs ask her about how to attend the masquerade ball, she'll respond by mentioning her fairy godmother. If the PCs ask about how to get some cash quick, again she'll respond about her fairy godmother. And assuming that the PCs go with Dolia to meet her fairy godmother, they follow her down a winding series of alleys and back streets, eventually reaching a hunched, antiquated, and mysterious-looking cottage. Dolia leads the PCs inside, and once inside, she undergoes a transformation. Dolia reveals that her true form is that of an anise hag. Apologizing for the false pretense, she introduces herself as Mamie Gliefpion, or Granny Stinky Claws if you don't like the French. Mamie Gliefpion immediately points out that one of the PCs looks exactly like the Count of Montagne de Sieur, and therefore asks if they're trying to go to the masquerade ball. Without being prompted, Gliefpion will mention that it's a wonderful place to steal from. And she offers to give the PCs a courtier's cravat and fancy clothes each, plus more so that they can attend the masquerade ball, if only the PCs do something for her. what she wants the PCs to do is travel across town to the Red Widow Theater. And as they go, they are supposed to take a magic item with them. This item looks like an amulet, but in the place of the locket, it's an eyeball that looks around. A hag's eye. Glyph-Pion mentions that it belongs to her coven, and she wants it situated in the Red Widow Theater, somewhere that's out of sight, but where it has a view of the stage. Glyph-Pion adds cryptically that if the PCs do this, they will also have to leave something personal there, but to not bother themselves with it at this time. She won't elaborate, she'll just say that it's a trifle and it shouldn't be anything to worry about. Indeed, she will drop the topic and mention all of the wonderful things that she will give to the PCs if only they perform this one errand at the Red Widow Theater. So off they go to the Red Widow Theater, and once they arrive, we have a scene that's very much like the scene with the Theater of the Vampires from Interview in the Vampire. It's a dimly lit, gothic, decadent-looking theater with a huge sculpture of a red widow spider over the stage. I imagine that that's a solid red spider with a black hourglass, or something iconic like that. There is some sparse attendance. And on stage, the PCs witness a play. In this play, a person hangs suspended from a giant spider's web, screaming. Now, for a map of the Red Widow Theater, I would use the notorious nightclub from page 151 of the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica. It's a fiendish nightclub associated with decadence, so it's perfect. Onto the stage scuttles a Drider-looking creature. Indeed, it's an actual Drider. The monster turns to the audience and says, "Do you not admire my realistic costume?" And then it rhapsodizes about the nature of mortality and how we are all caught in death's web, and it is only time before the spider's jaws devour us all. As the soliloquy proceeds, the victim in the web cries out for help, but nobody pays attention, and at the end of the soliloquy, the Drider kills the person. At the act's conclusion, a number of other spider-like creatures, ettercaps, will swarm the stage and consume the remains. Now, as the PCs witness this grisly event, that is a wonderful occasion to call for something like stress damage, or a stress check, or a dread check, or some kind of wisdom check associated with being horrified. Shortly thereafter, the Drider on stage will call one of the PCs up to be next, and whether they accept or reject the invitation, it's time to roll for initiative. The PCs are not supposed to be at the Red Widow Theater. It's a monster's lair, and the monsters don't want them there. And so now the PCs face a Drider, along with the other audience members and stagehands who are all ettercaps. Assuming the PCs prevail, and assuming they also hid the hag's eye somewhere in the theater, they know they can leave, having fulfilled their end of their bargain with Mamie Glyph-Pion. Now, as the PCs make their way back to Mamie Glyph-Pion's cottage, they should notice something horrifying about their own bodies. Various parts of their bodies have been transformed into spider anatomy. Maybe some spider-like mandibles protrude from their mouth. Maybe their hands have become spider legs. Maybe they have 10 eyes atop their forehead. But something spider-esque has happened to them. When they arrive at Glyph-Pion's cottage, she reassures them that those changes will go away at the next dawn. Their old anatomy was simply something personal of theirs that they had to leave behind for a while at the Red Widow Theater, along with the Hag's Eye. Mamie Glyph-Pion cautions the PCs that this cannot be undone, and she consoles the PCs, or aims to, by pointing out that such deformities can be disguised. Out of thin air, Mamie Glyph-Pion then conjures all kinds of delicate, beautiful embroidered clothing for the PCs, along with a courtier's cravat for each. In addition, Mamie Glyph-Pion transforms a rotting jack-o'-lantern into a stagecoach, and a quartet of disgusting, horrid rats into a quartet of Clydesdale horses. The expensive clothing that Glyph-Pion has summoned is sufficient to cover up, or mostly cover up, the spider-like features that the PCs have acquired, and she tells them to hurry to the Masquerade Ball, for these illusions, the fancy clothing, the stagecoach, and even the courtier's cravats, will not last past midnight. At the stroke of midnight, they will all disintegrate, revealing the PCs to be commoners, nay, commoners with horrid spider anatomy. And with that, Act 2 ends, the PCs level up to 6, and we proceed to Act 3, the final act of our adventure in Dementlieu. Having reached level 6, Act 3 begins with the stagecoach dropping off the PCs at the entrance to the Duchess's mansion. The footmen outside ask for the PC's identity. Assuming that the relevant PC in question claims to be the Count de Montagne d'Essier, or Countess de Montagne d'Essier, the footmen hand masquerade masks to the PCs and direct them to go inside. Now, for Duchess Cedra de Honer's mansion, I would use the Castellanter's Villa from Waterdeep Dragon Heist on page 119. And I would specifically have Cedra's footmen lead the PCs up the stairs to area C13, which is the ballroom. Because it is upstairs and only has a couple other exits, it's a claustrophobic place from which there is no easy escape, and ideally fits the mood of what will follow. Now when the PCs arrive, the ballroom is filled with all manner of guests who are wearing masquerade costumes, and the Duchess is not yet present. The PCs are soon approached by a man in a mask who introduces himself as the Marquis de Chauvignard. He says he's very good friends with the Duchess and asks the PCs who they are and makes small talk. During that conversation, a servant carrying a tray of wine glasses will walk by. At that moment, the Marquis will wink at the PCs and then violently elbow the servant, causing the servant to spill the wine. The Marquis de Chauvignard will then take the opportunity to scold, insult, and even beat the servant for spilling the wine. As he does so, other aristocrats will look on and laugh. It's a scene of horrifying cruelty, and the PCs should experience some tension as, on one hand, they have an urge to intercede, but on the other hand, they cannot blow their cover. Now, the PCs can react to this however they want, but as they do so, the scene is interrupted by a scream. It turns out that, while the PC's attention was occupied with this servant and the Marquis, the Duchess not only arrived, but discovered that someone was not who they claimed to be. And at this point, we read the description which is included in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft in the section about Dementlieu. You! A piercing voice cuts through the noise of the ball. The music stops and conversations hush as all eyes turn to the Duchess Cedra and the poor fool she's confronted. The mask falls from his terror-struck face as the Duchess raises her hand. You dare intrude into the sanctity of my home? She intones. A hunched, ghoulish footman clutching a dustpan scrambles forward. You defile my grand masquerade with your unworthy presence? I condemn you. With these words, a chill wave emanates from the Duchess, and the unmasked figure crumbles to dust. The Duchess turns away, the ghoulish footman starts sweeping the mess up, and everyone around you pointedly returns to their own business. That's the scene that plays out, and you can allow the PCs to react to it, look around, maybe explore a bit more. But soon after that event, a footman will approach the Duchess and loudly announce that one of the guests is her dear friend, the Count of Montagne Dessieux. Upon that exchange, as soon as the footman says this, Cedra will shriek that the Count of Montagne Dessieux is dead. She executed him herself for being an imposter. She demands that the footman reveal who this guest is who's claiming to be the Count, who this imposter is, so they can be executed in turn. The footman and the Duchess both, of course, turn to survey the room, and it's at this moment that the PCs would be wise to avert their gaze, talk amongst themselves, and then try to bluff their way around the room as all the aristocrats proceed to investigate and interrogate one another. Several aristocrats will ask the PCs who they are. Didn't you say that you are the Count of Montagne Dessieux? Maybe they can intimidate, maybe they can deceive, maybe they can persuade. And if the PCs attempt to leave, they will find a half-dozen ghoulish footmen barring the exit to the ballroom, saying, "Sorry, we cannot let anyone leave until Cedra has found a foul impersonator." Now, maybe the PCs will decide to fight the footmen, but right before they do so, they hear something. A bell chiming midnight. As the bells chime midnight, all of the PCs' clothing fades away into rags. Their tights, the brocaded jackets, even the courtiers' cravats, they all fade away, revealing their spider-like anatomy. A wave of screams sweeps across the ballroom. But as the PCs look, there is a turn of events that surprises them. Every other guest at the Masquerade is succumbing to exactly the same fate as the PCs. The clothing, in other words, of every guest is fading away into rags, and every guest is revealed to have some kind of monstrous anatomy. Snake parts, spider parts, frog parts, centipede parts. They all have accursed deformities. The implication, of course, is that nobody here is who they claim to be, and that everyone has struck some kind of fell bargain to bluff their way to the ball. Now at this point, chaos ensues. Over a dozen attendees use the statistics for troglodytes, square off against a half-dozen ghoulish footmen, and amidst the fray, the Duchess Cedra de Honor screams, rips off her mask, and floats into the air as she transforms into some kind of vaporous, crimson-red creature. The Red Death. We're going to give Cedra the statistics for a gallows speaker with maximum hit points and legendary resistance, who uses her legendary actions to attack the PCs, and who, as her action each round on her turn, uses her disintegrate ability to destroy one of the troglodyte guests. This way, the PCs can fight against the Duchess, but also not be overpowered by her admittedly broken disintegrate spell. Should the PCs defeat Cedra amidst this chaos, the Dehonor mansion begins to shake and crumble, Shadowfell mist begins to creep in and swirl all about, and as the PCs flee the mansion, they fly into the mist, out of Dementlieu, and on to their next adventure. And that's our adventure in Dementlieu. What do you think? I apologize it took me so long to make this video, but this was a popularly requested domain and I wanted to make sure that I did it some justice. And well, did I? You'll notice that there are some locations on Dementlieu that I did not use, the museum for instance. And I also stuck to the sort of plot which is strongly suggested by the lore laid out in Van Richten's guide. Would you have done that? And what other ideas would you have brought to Dementlieu, this domain of decadent delirium? Let me know in the comments. As always, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to do the internet things, click like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell icon if you want notifications about updates on this channel, and don't forget to share this video. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next one.